It's a key.
Hello again. Today I have an on first glance simple looking but extremely tricky pin tumbler lock for you, the Assa 700 with Christmas tree drivers. This lock has 7 chambers that contain a mixture of several specialized security pins. Some of the chambers have undercuts that will interact with one of the 2 main driver types in this lock. There's no additional locking mechanism implemented, which might look quite unsuspicious, but dare you to think it will be an easy open. As said, there are 2 general types of drivers in the latest version of this lock. On the one hand, there are standard drivers that also can be tapered, and on the other hand there are gin bottle spools that also can come in the so-called Xmas or Christmas tree pin version. As key pins we have either standards or torpedoes. In this lock we will find standard or torpedoes mostly in position 3, 5 and 7. In chamber 1, 2, 4 and 6 we will find Christmas tree pins if the key pin is not too long, so a shorter regular gin as driver would be required. A driver of this category may look like a more or less regular spool, but way more engineering and nastiness went into this design, as I will now try to explain in more detail. Besides precise machining, very good tolerances and clever pin placement, is another hidden detail the main reason for the great amount of difficulty while learning and picking this lock. All 4 key pin chambers that correspond with the gin type driver have undercuts that matches with the head of this pin. It is not only a rough or serrated like area that grabs the pin a bit, offers a little bit more pick resistance or just dampens the feedback. It adds a whole new level to the main pin tumbler concept as it binds up the driver and the core completely every time it reaches a specific state during an attack. This makes picking it the regular way without the correct technique and absolute precise tension control close to impossible. You really need to know how this mechanism is working to get the idea of how to defeat such a beast. To make life harder, the Assa engineers added some tapered pins and spoolish elements to this lock. The gin undercut design can be found in several other Assa locks, also sometimes combined with additional locking mechanisms. Also other lock brands like the Japanese Gold Company have their version of this idea implemented. I use a Christmas tree driver as example, as this also covers the regular gin behavior. As key pin I use a torpedo pin that behaves like a standard until the driver is set to shear. I will explain its special characteristics later in this demonstration as well. Depending on the key pin length, the Christmas tree driver will start in one of 3 possible states in the default position. With short key pins, as shown in this image, the driver will start in the standard state, followed by the spool state and ending with the gin state. The regular gin driver does not have the spoolish segment and therefore no spool state. In the standard state, a Christmas tree or gin pin behaves like a regular non-security driver and will bind and be picked as usual. It should give a noticeable click and a feedback when set. Once no driver remains in the standard state, the Christmas tree driver will enter the spool state as the core has now a little bit room to rotate. This results in a visible false set. You can push the pin up to a certain height, but the sharp lips of the driver will grab hard into the undercut. You might feel a little bit of typical spoolish counter-rotation at this point, but the good tolerances will dampen the feedback and make it tricky to set even with manually counter-rotating the plug. At this point, this pin can be seen as a very sharp cut spool that bites into a serrated chamber. Use the jiggle test to differ from already set tapered pins. The pin might also feel a little bit springy if set to the next state, but it's sometimes hard to tell. If no pin is left in the spool state, the core can rotate more and will give an even deeper false set. Even if the state looks quite similar as the state before, there's a huge difference between them. The gin element of the pin will now interact with the undercut in such a way that it is not longer possible to set with just pushing it further. There is no counter-rotation or clear feedback, everything is just stuck. The core won't turn and the driver seem like welded. You could sometimes even let off the tension and everything would stay in place. As the gin part is not very long and the lip is a bit thicker than before, there is not a lot room for the pin to move, which results in a weird feedback. It feels like the pin is barely moving, in best case just a tiny bit jiggly. It needs time to learn how this state differs from others as well as the set position. You should use progressively pinning for practicing this. To set a pin in the gin state, you have to absolutely precise counter-rotate the core. Enough that the pin head is not longer stuck in the undercut, but not too much that the other already set pins would drop. While manually counter-rotating the plug in as small increments as possible, you should continuously tap with the pick against the pin to feel the exact moment when you can push it further than before, which means that it's now out of the undercut. The differences in rotation between a stuck pin, a freed pin and dropping pins is extremely small. Running into the ping pong problem will be the regular case, even with a lot of practice, experience and a special tensioning technique that uses two tension tools called float picking. The ping pong problem means that setting one element will drop others. Once you found that described sweet spot, you can lift the pin to shear and rotate the core just enough to hold everything in place until the lock is fully picked. Setting such a driver to shear can make little click but also give no feedback at all, which results often in an under or oversetting, so that you have to apply many attempts until the pin is set correctly. Oversetting a pin in this lock can be very annoying, as this is the moment when the special feature of the torpedo key pin comes into play. The shape of this key pin makes it quite easy to lift it over shear. If you then rotate the core, thinking the gin element is set, you might get a little false set as the key pin is now stuck in the Bible chamber. This tiny false set will hold the key pin in place, and even if this is easy to detect, it is super hard to get the key pin back without dropping everything you have set before. One extra reason to be as precise as possible while picking those pins. Besides the Christmas tree or gin driver, there are also tapered pins in this lock. When you start to pick this lock, you will try to find all Christmas tree or gin pins in their standard state and all tapered pins first. The annoying about tapered pins is that they often don't give clear feedback and have to be pushed several times, as they allow the core to rotate always a tiny bit each time they have been pushed, so that other pin starts to bind and you have to go through the whole lock over and over again. The main technique for those pins is to increase the tension a lot and to double tap each pin you touch to make sure it can move as much as possible. Go over all pins even if they don't feel like binding until you get the false set that indicates the spool state of the other driver type. To sum up, the main strategy is the following. Heavy tension and go tapping through all pins as long as you get a clear false set in the standard state. Keep in mind that the tapered pins will dampen the feedback. In the spool state, you should use lighter tension and set all binding pins with pushing them against the counter rotation. Maybe you need to manually counter rotate a bit, but in general it's like setting a good machined regular spool with serrated chamber. If this is finished successfully, you should notice a deeper false set. A set pin could be slightly jiggly in this state. In the gin state, absolute precise tension control is needed. Counter rotate very slowly to find that sweet spot where the pin can be pushed but no other element will drop. Keep in mind that even with the best technique, the ping pong problem will occur quite often. Rotate the core a bit once the pin is set to stabilize all parts. Also, double checking all pins will help. As a little tip for an advanced attack, you can try to set a Christmas tree pin in the spool state directly to shear and skip the gin part, but then it is also more difficult to hold in place, as you cannot directly rotate the core enough to make everything very stable. It also increases the risk for the ping pong problem. To apply the needed level of tension control, you need to use the so-called float picking technique. When the lock also contains a sidebar, like in the Assa Twin 6000, it already applies counter rotation by itself that allows a step-by-step in and decreasing of rotation, which may be sufficient. In a pure pin tumbler lock like the Assa 700, you have to find the absolute perfect fitting tension wrench, or much easier, use two opposing tension wrenches. If you place them stable and like shown or similar, you can perfectly control every plug movement that is needed during all states. Make sure the wrenches don't slip out of the keyway and leave enough room to operate with your tools. Getting used to all of those techniques and steps will take time and be frustrating while learning, but it's worth it. Very awesome once you get your first open and when you really see your skills developing with each little progress. If you really want to deep dive into the theory of picking gins, I can highly recommend Artichoke's video on that topic. I will put a link in the description. Let me now demonstrate how this strategy could look like. So first let's start this key. And of course it's working. Then I will apply counterclockwise tension with this beautiful tension wrench from Lambda 2. And additional to that I will use a second tension wrench as I have to apply float picking. Make sure the tools have a snuggle fit so you have the best possible tension control. For picking I will use this deep hook V05 from Multipick in a thickness of 0.4 mm. For the beginning I will use heavy tension as I have to deal with tapered elements, and I will start with pin number 4. Click out of him. Something decent out of 3. something out of 5, something out of 3, something out of 5, okay, touch on 3 and we got a tiny bit of core movement. 7 is binding. Click out of him and a greater amount of core movement, so I think we are done with this part. Now we are hanging on the spoolish part of each Christmas tree pin, starting with 4 again. Okay. Now number 2. Okay, hopefully I could set him directly to shear. Set 1, even if it's just regular gin. I lost 4. Okay. Now I have to reset 2. Okay, 2 fields set, 4 fields okay, 6 has to be set. Okay, I think 6 is set, but we lost 4. And we lost 2. And 4 again. So 1 is set. Okay, 1, 2, and 4 are set. 6 is now in its gin part. Six is now set to shear, but 2 dropped. 2 is now set to shear, so hopefully 4 is left. And we are open. Nice. Okay, let's cut this. Okay, so now let's remove this lovely clip. I pre-bended it that I should be able to remove it without too many issues. Okay, perfect. Then I will use a 3D printed follower, as the diameter of the Assa 700 is slightly bigger than normal locks. I will turn the lock a little bit so that this side is pointing to the driver chamber. This allows me to gut this lock without shims. Now gently pushing out the core like this. Now I will drop the key pins. Now let's take a close look at this core. So now we can see each of the 7 chambers, and also we can see that in number 1, 2, 4 and 6 we have undercuts. Very sharp undercuts, of course, on both sides. The other chambers are normal ones. Also, we have some additional holes for anti-drill inserts. Very precise machined lock. Okay, let's continue with the drivers. Okay, let's take a close look at this nice solid lock body. So that's a nice oval shaped massive thing. You can see the 7 chambers for the drivers. Nothing too special here, no additional modifications. Very shiny thing. So let me rearrange everything for a nice close-up. Okay, so take a look at all those beautiful pins. First, let's check out the key pins. They are made all out of steel. Some have some additional anti-drill inserts, but the most interesting ones are key pin number 1, 2, 6 and 7, as those are torpedo pins. Let me show you them in a close-up. You can see them. They have this spoolish part on top. So if you overset this pin, he will get stuck and it's very hard to get out. You will feel it as you will receive counter rotation, and the key pin won't drop back down. The other pins are standard ones. This is the third one. This has an, as said, anti-drill protection inside, but otherwise it's very normal. Key pin number 1 is the only regular gin in this lock, as the cutting depth does not allow something different, because the spoolish part wouldn't come into play. And here we can see one of those beautiful shiny Christmas tree drivers. You can see the standard part, the spoolish part and the gin part, which makes this like a 3-type security pin. Very, very nasty to pick. Then we have in chamber number 3 this tapered part. This is looks like a regular standard, but it's not. It has tapered tips, additional to an anti-drill feature. And because of this tapered end, you have to set this type of pin mostly several times and use quite high tension. Okay, so number 2, 4 and 6 are those Christmas tree pins, and number 1 is a regular gin. All of them have to be float picked, but first get out of their spoolish part, and number 4 is the driver can sink in quite a lot in the key chamber. It behaves like a standard pin at the beginning. All in all, a very, very well engineered design. It looks like a regular, more or less, pin tumbler lock, but it's definitely not. It's one of the hardest lock I learned so far. Depending on the bitting and how many of those gin and spoolish part comes into play, it's really a big struggle, and I recommend to progressively pin this lock if you want to learn it. It's a fun lock in any case, but it will take quite a lot of time to learn and to master. I can only say very good work, Assa. That's really a big challenge. So that's it. That's the Assa 700 with Christmas tree pins. Thanks for watching, see you soon, and goodbye.